Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I am Jacob Shapiro, the Director of Analysis. Earlier this week, I went on our good friend Leighton Smith from New Zealand's podcast, and we talked a little bit about Hong Kong, what's going on in China right now, and also specifically what Australia and New Zealand's perspective on all of this is. They were good enough to share the segment of our conversation with us for the podcast, and now we're sharing it with you here. So I hope you all enjoy, and we'll see you out there.
Jacob Shapiro is the Director of Analysis for Geopolitical Futures, and it is great to have you back on the show.
It's always nice to be here with you, Leighton.
Let me quote from your article published a few days ago. Hong Kong's present is Taiwan's future. That captured my attention immediately. After 3 months, the Hong Kong extradition protests of 2019 have become quotidian. And everybody is headed for the dictionary. The Monday morning question for China watchers has not been whether a protest took place, but how many people showed up or how violently clashed with the police or with one another. Was this going to be the Monday that the Chinese government might finally decide that enough was enough and that the rule of law must be reinstated by force in the Special Administrative Region, otherwise known as Hong Kong? Since you published that, how would you update it? How have things changed, if they have?
Well, first, I have to give credit for that word to my editor, Emma, because I myself didn't have it in there. I like to think that I have a pretty good vocabulary, and she outdid me there. But look, I don't think that a whole lot has changed. I will tell you that that piece, usually when I put out a piece, I'm a little more sure of myself. That piece for me was really here's a theory, and I'd like to think about it a little bit more. I think the most important or surprising thing that has happened since I wrote that article is not the protest in the airport. I think you're going to see more of that sort of thing in Hong Kong. It was that, and I forget what the exact name of the office is. It's the Chinese government's basically representative in Hong Kong. I think it's the Hong Kong Macau representative affair to the State Council of the CC, whatever. They love their acronyms over there. But they likened what was going on in Hong Kong just today to terrorism. And that was by far the strongest language I've seen out of the Chinese government in reference to what's going on there. And you got to think that China doesn't like the extent to which the rule of law does seem to be, I don't want to say the word disintegrating, but has certainly deteriorated in Hong Kong. But as I said in that piece, I just don't see how it pays for China to intervene heavy-handedly. It doesn't get them what they want.
Well, what you wrote, and I made a note beside it, government patience was what I said. You said it's immensely difficult for protest movements to sustain the intensity and magnitude necessary to drive real political change. When protests become a regular weekend activity, usually means that they have lost the momentum necessary to create that political change. And you refer also to the yellow vests in France. So the government in Beijing, I get from what you've said, has decided, at least for the present, to give them space, let them wear themselves out, and then things will return to order, maybe with a little assistance, you say?
I think that's what they're hoping, and I think that, it's not just about wearing themselves out. It's that at a certain point, the protesters are actually making life difficult for the majority of people living in Hong Kong. So I think when they shut down the airport today, something like 160 outbound flights were canceled. If you yourself are living in Hong Kong on the weekend, suddenly you can't enjoy living in Hong Kong because you've got protesters here, and you've got violence here, and you've got tear gas in the park. At a certain point, your audience, which is all the people that are living around you, start to get more annoyed with you than with the injustices that you're supposed to be protesting.
Except that there has been a lot, I think more than ever, if I'm not mistaken, out in the streets and protesting. Would you say they were largely millennials?
Oh, I don't know. What is a millennial to you, Leighton? I hear that word thrown around all the time, and I know that I'm technically in the age gap for them. So what is a millennial?
Well, it's an age group, but I resisted it at first, and then I just finally adopted it because it was everywhere. So now I throw it out occasionally, but mostly in their late 20s. I'm thinking at the moment as far as Hong Kong is concerned.
Well, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons the protests are less than impressive to me. The protests that were really shocking, and I think I referenced this in the piece, were those ones at the beginning of June that coalesced against that extradition bill. And for some reason that I can't figure out, that extradition bill was just the straw that broke the camel's back. And for that protest, you had grandmothers in the streets, and you had mothers with their children. You had everybody coming out to say, this is not okay. We are residents of Hong Kong. I'm willing to go out into the streets and say this is not okay. I think you're absolutely right when you start talking about the types of clashes we've seen the last couple of weekends, when you talk about going to an airport terminal and staging a sit-in and sitting there for an entire weekend. Sure, if you're a retired businessman in Hong Kong, or if you're a mother with 3 children, you don't have time to go do that. What you need to do is make sure that the streets are open so you can get to go wherever you want to go to. So in a certain sense, protests of that magnitude, yeah, it's a young person's game.
You say to understand why and to understand Hong Kong in the first place, we need to examine a bit of Chinese history and geography. And you basically are covering in the history of civilization around the 3 important rivers. Do you want to cover that for us?
Sure. For me, it's Chinese history goes back so far. It's probably the first human civilization that emerges, right? Maybe you could go to the Tigris and Euphrates and the cradle of civilization there. But they're Chinese civilization is so old, there's so much history. When I break it down, it's really sort of in 3 stages. And it's in these 3 rivers that sort of, they trisect mainland China, if you will. It all starts around the Yellow River. Once you consolidate control over the Yellow River, you move a little bit south to the Yangtze River. And then from the Yangtze River, you get to the Pearl River. Right? And Hong Kong is part of not just itself, but it's part of a broader part of southern China that was really the last area to be drawn into Chinese civilization. And places like Hong Kong, places like Taiwan, they weren't even really settled by the Chinese originally, right? They were founded and settled by Western Europeans. Taiwan, I think the Portuguese were the first ones to get there. Hong Kong, obviously, the British were the first ones to build a substantial population base there. It is only in the last couple hundred years, which for the history of Chinese civilization is a drop in the bucket, that you have China thinking about how to integrate these areas. So that's why I use the 3 rivers, because Hong Kong it's almost not even a part of mainland China, right? It's separated a little bit.
Yeah. All right. So it's inconceivable, though, that China would let Hong Kong go, and ditto for Taiwan.
Well, I think so. When you look at the real impetus, or the real core, the real ideological core of this Chinese government, going back to the beginning of the People's Republic of China, it's really about one thing. And it's not about Marxism, and it's not about Leninism, and it's not about Maoism, and it's not about all the other. It is about restoring China's territorial integrity. It is about restoring China's unity. More than anything, it is about making sure that external powers don't get to come in and blow up China the way that they did in the 19th and even in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say, if you are the PRC, it is much more important that you are able to demonstrate, first, that you are managing social cohesion and social stability at home, but also that you are making steps to make sure that these areas that are, from the Chinese perspective, still under some level of Western control or Western influence or Western brainwashing, you can bring them back into the fold.
So when you talk about Western influence and brainwashing, are you talking simply politically, or are you talking culturally, or both?
I'm talking, well, it's hard at a certain point to say where politics ends and where culture begins, right? The interesting thing about places like Hong Kong, places like Taiwan, to a lesser extent Macau, these were places that originally, that they don't go back thousands of years in Chinese history, right? They were settled only recently. The political systems that they have there were developed by the colonial occupiers. So Hong Kong, Hong Kong has this thing where it's one country, 2 systems, and Hong Kong is supposed to have its own separate political system. That's a British colonial system. When these Hong Kong protesters want to express how they're dissatisfied with their relationship with the Beijing government, what do? They take out a colonial flag, right? Like a colonial British flag, and they say, well, we want to go back to this. So I think that's what's going on there.
When it comes to China's other activities in the South China Sea and beyond, and let's extend this conversation momentarily, at least down as far as Papua New Guinea, if not to Australia. Only 10 days or so back, there were stories that Papua New Guinea had approached China and asked them to refinance their entire government debt, which in the greater scheme of things, internationally, is not a lot of money, but to Papua New Guinea it is, of course. This is of great concern to Australia and New Zealand and probably other countries even further north, because this would extend China's power and influence right into our part of the world. So they're attempting, in their willingness, I'd throw Fiji in there too for geopolitical reasons. They're attempting in their willingness to spread themselves around to do the same thing that they're trying to deny places closer to home like Hong Kong and Taiwan, their existence. How does that work for them?
Well, first of all, Hong Kong and Taiwan are considered part of China, so it's a very different thing. The Chinese government's relationship with a Hong Kong or with a Taiwan is going to be completely different than its relationship with, say, a Philippines or a Papua New Guinea. But I think if you're sitting in Australia and New Zealand, you are actually incredibly well equipped to understand just what Papua New Guinea is going through, right? Both Australia and New Zealand have a situation now where their most important security partner is the United States. Their most important trading partner is China. Now, if you're Papua New Guinea, you get a smaller version of that because you're not necessarily, well, the United States is also a part of the concern, right? But if you're Papua New Guinea, you're sort of caught between Australia and New Zealand and having to continually make sure that you're okay in their good graces. And then looking to China as some kind of thing to give you some level of independence, some level of balance in a system that you've always had to sort of go along with, no matter what. And B, China's struggling through this, right? But I think what China's trying to do in this part of the world is that it's trying to give its money or restructure its debt or build all this infrastructure with no strings attached. It wants to present an economic and political model that it can say, no, look, this is better than the other things that you were going to do before. Give us a chance. And then in the long term, when we become more powerful, we'll be able to help you out in all sorts of other ways. So if you're Papua New Guinea, it makes some level of sense to hedge your bets on that score.
You wrote, this is a Chinese government that has elevated Xi Jinping to the de facto position of emperor-in-chief and is busily attempting to remake the Uyghurs in the image of the Han via re-education camps. China is not intervening in Hong Kong because it chooses not to. Now, with regard to the internal situation with China, and I'm linking this a little awkwardly, I'll admit, but I'm linking this to what you just said about China saying to Papua New Guinea or anybody else, we got a better system, give us a go. Because within China, everything is not entirely comfortable. If they took the shall we say, the military brakes off, the physical brakes off China, would not China change internally?
Well, that's the 5 trillion yuan question, right? Would China change internally? I think that if you had Mao on your show right now and you said, can China change internally, he would have told you yes, and then 30 years in, he would have admitted defeat, right? Because Mao came in with all these ideas about permanent revolution, and they were going to forget the Confucian past, and they were going to move beyond all that other stuff. And when you look at what's happening in China today, what are they doing? Well, Xi is talking about how he's the same level of Mao, and we have to learn Confucius again, and we have to rediscover Chinese culture, and Han Chinese ethnic chauvinism is going to be okay for everyone. I think when you look at the history of China, and one of the reasons that China is such a formidable, I don't want to use the word opponent, one of the reasons China is such a formidable force in general is because you can't move it. You know, people have conquered China before, and they just become Chinese just because it's such a large, strong center of gravity. So it's hard for me to say one way or another, but I think I don't think that China actually changes that much, right? It looks different. It has to do certain things. But if you look at Chinese history, it actually is pretty similar over time. I think what you have now is you have Xi Jinping consolidating control over mainland China. And I guess the biggest debate there is to have about China is he doing that from a position of weakness? Is he doing that because is he doing this because China's going to fall apart if he doesn't do that? Or is he doing it from a position of strength? Does he just recognize that China is at a phase in its history where it needs a strong hand in order to to get to the next stage in its history, Xi needs to be powerful. I increasingly think the latter. You've had George Friedman on this program many times, and he thinks the former, and he and I yell and scream at each other about it all the time. But I think that's the question, and you've put your finger right on it.
All right, so where do you think Xi thinks that China will be in, you choose the time zone, 50 years?
In 50 years, well, I mean, 50 years takes us beyond 2047, which is when one country, two systems with Hong Kong is supposed to end, to go back to where we were talking before. You know, I think that Xi Jinping took his Marxist training seriously. He seems to have, if you listen and read all of his statements. I think he looks at the United States as in a secular decline. I think he looks at China as sort of inevitably poised to become, if not a great global power in 50 years, certainly the dominant regional power in the Asia Pacific. And I think Xi Jinping sees it as his job to get China to that stage. Obviously, he won't be around for it, but the decisions that the Xi Jinping administration is going to make will either make or break China's ability to become anything more than just, you know, a regional center of gravity that people want to trade with, or a regional power that can start dictating terms not just to Hong Kong and Taiwan, but to, say, the Philippines and to Japan and even to India.
And the South Pacific?
I think that the South Pacific is fairly isolated here. China has to get a heck of a lot more powerful before the South Pacific really has to worry about Chinese encroachment. I think when you think about Chinese policy, they're basically reaching out to everywhere. But if I'm the South Pacific, I'm much less concerned about China's rise, not just right now, in the next couple of decades, than I am, say, a country like the Philippines or a country like Malaysia, a country like Singapore. These are countries that are much closer to China, that China is going to want to engage in a closer relationship with. On the outside, look, all China wants out of the South Pacific is for it to be a little less American. That's the only thing that they can really hope for now. They would like to be able to at least have a conversation with some of these South Pacific countries, and that includes Australia and New Zealand, that doesn't preclude a conversation with them just because they are China. In the long term, you know, as long as the South Pacific isn't going to be the source of a major threat to China, then China's probably not going to want a whole heck of a lot out of it, except, you know, economic relationships, because that's what China historically wants with countries on the periphery, where countries like Australia and New Zealand and even Fiji, Papua New Guinea would have to really worry is if the United States and China are hurtling towards some sort of inevitable conflict. And that, you know, I'm not resigned to that being the future, but it is certainly hard to believe that the Chinese are thinking any other way right this second.
Well, that let me just counter you slightly. They don't have to do much to affect Australia and New Zealand as far as trade is concerned, in particular. Mm-hmm. Now, Australia is going to be more concerned about it than New Zealand because they're a bigger country, bigger population, bigger land mass, and they're quite exposed in the north, which is why I saw a story a couple of days ago with regard to Darwin re-entering the importance zone as it did during the Second World War. But trading routes, shipping routes, etc., would be very easily stymied by the Chinese, or anybody else for that matter, who had the will to do so, and that would affect both these former British colonies, if you want.
Yes, but I guess I would say that I don't see that China has either the will or the ability to do so in the next 2 to 3 decades. If you're asking 50 years out, well, it's hard to plan for such things, and I'm not sure either one of us will be around to see the fruition of this forecast. But sure,
the way science is moving, you never know.
Well, yeah, I hear that there's a little blue pill is going to let me live forever if I can just make it to 40. Then everything's going to be fine. But yeah, look, like the Chinese system, like I said again, it doesn't want these trade wars. It doesn't want to stop trade. When you think about how China thinks about trade and economics in general, it thinks of itself quite literally as the Middle Kingdom, and it wants all these peripheral powers to think of China as this economic center of the world and then trade with it on a preferential basis, right? China has never, and I don't think wants to get into the business of policing global sea lanes or doing all these other things. The only thing that would make China do that is if it comes into conflict with a power that is blocking things from it. And this is why I'm so nervous right now about the US-China relationship. And the only analog I have for this is Japan. The moment that the United States and Japan were destined to have a war with each other was the moment where the United States said, we're cutting off your oil. We don't like the things that you're doing in the Pacific. Now we're going to do something for you. And at that moment, the Japanese decided, okay, we're going to have to fight a war. The interesting thing that's happening in China today is that they're having to import more and more things from abroad, right? They're importing food. They don't have enough water. They're importing oil. That has to do with all the things that are going on in Iran. That might make China much more aggressive than it ever has been in its history. And maybe then they're going to think about securing maritime trading lanes. But they're not even close to that right now. Right now, what they need is stable trading partners so they can ward off this U.S. trade war.
The mention of Xi and the future, how established is Marxism, communism in China? Is it just a passing phase? In other words,
well, that's a great question. On the one hand, if you read and listen to Xi Jinping talk, you can tell that he's been sort of raised as a Marxist and taught as a Marxist and thinks of the world through a sort of Marxist spectrum. On the other hand, this is the same president of China who, when he came to power, was talking about supply side reforms, which is something that Ronald Reagan used to talk about here back in the 1980s in the United States. So I think ultimately Xi is a pragmatist. I think the part of Marxism that Xi certainly has, and I think that to a certain extent I would say that I fall into this category too, is I think he thinks in terms of structural forces dictating what's going to happen on the global stage. And I think in that sense, I think Xi does think about the power specifically of class. I think it's not very Marxist for him to also think about the importance of nation. And I think you're seeing a real crystallization of Chinese nationalism, which is something I don't think that Marx would have said very much about. So I would say that it's sort of what they say in China, right? It's with Chinese characteristics. It's Marxism with Chinese characteristics, security with Chinese characteristics. It's certainly not Marxism as you and I would read, Karl Marx wrote, but basically nobody used Marx that way, right? I think it is correct to say that Xi thinks in terms of structural forces and thinks of himself of trying to position China in a way that it benefits rather than gets hurt by those forces.
What is his opinion, do you think, of Trump?
Oh man, I would love to be able to sit down and have a nice piece of chocolate cake with Xi and talk about Trump. I'm referring obviously to that first time they had a meeting and they shared chocolate cake at Mar-a-Lago. I think that, look, it's impossible for me to know what Xi Jinping thinks, but I can tell you based on how he acted, I don't think that he took President Trump very seriously at first. And I think that, China was feeling very strong and very sure of itself. And then the United States went all in on the trade war. And I think that caught both Xi Jinping and the entire governing political class in China a bit off guard. I think there was a real moment of danger there for Xi where he might have lost control of the system, but I think he's weathered the storm. I think right now you actually have a more united political front in China about its relationship with the United States than you've had in maybe decades. So overall, I think that, and again, this goes back to structural forces. I don't think that Xi thinks much about President Trump because he knows that either in another 2 years or another 6 years, he won't have to deal with a President Trump anymore, right? He's really thinking about, well, everybody in the political class in the United States seems to be getting on board with this anti-China message, right? So I have to make sure that China can defend itself. And it's a very different China than the one that we were talking about even 10 years ago.
However you pronounce it, but Huawei, the company, just in this part of the world today, the day we're recording, they're saying as far as the situation here is concerned, either get your act together or we're gone. In other words, stop playing around. We want to know where we're at or we're leaving. Mm-hmm. What would that mean as far as both them and New Zealand is concerned?
Well, for a country like New Zealand, if Huawei goes away, then you have to pay more money for equipment that isn't as good. But you'll be fine. You'll get equipment that works almost as well, and everything will be okay. But I mean, this goes to a much broader issue about sort of, I don't know if it's going to be a bifurcation or if it's going to be even more regional spheres of influence. But you're seeing this more and more. A lot of people thought of technology and the internet as this sort of elemental globalizing force. And what you're seeing right now is states are beginning to control technology. States are beginning to control the internet and use it for their own purposes. So I think that the U.S. threat, I think that the U.S. has played up the Huawei threat a little bit, specifically the Huawei threat. But I think in the broad scheme of things, if you look at what China's been doing with its internet, if you look at what Russia's been doing with its internet, if you look at just Huawei in general and its sort of shady connections to the Chinese government, there is a really there's a real sense that China is going to use this as a tool. And I think for the West, it's a wake-up call, because suddenly, there's a Chinese company that has the best technology on something, and that if you want the best in class, you're going to have to want to go to Huawei. So if I'm New Zealand, if I'm Great Britain, if I'm the United States, if I'm Canada, you've kind of already lost the Huawei fight and the 5G fight. And it's not going to determine the overall conflict, but it's a loss. And if you're a country like New Zealand or a country like the United States, you're going to have alternatives. And that's very difficult in a situation with Huawei, because they have the full force and funding of the Chinese government behind them, and they have a very good sense of where they're going. The only thing that Western countries can really compete with is that the Chinese system doesn't encourage innovation. The thing that the West has always thrived on is using that innovation to create still new things, whereas China has been able to say, okay, 5G, this is a combination of technology that's pretty easily accessible and infrastructure. We're just going to throw everything we can at it and do it. So yeah, that's what I would say on that score.
All right. So to conclude, the idea of your article was really to draw attention to from Hong Kong and what's going on to China, asking the question, what will happen in Hong Kong is not necessary. That's a fait accompli. The real question is what will happen in Taiwan. Your best guess, you write, in the long term, China will have more of an interest in assimilating Taiwan than anyone else will have in defending it. That Hong Kong's present is Taiwan's future. Got a timescale for that?
I would guess, I don't think that they would try to do it before 2047. I think they would want to integrate Hong Kong completely before they do it. They also are going to want to get the Chinese Navy. I mean, the Chinese Navy is doing some interesting things, and I'm very impressed with the speed at which they've modernized. They still can't compete with the United States. And Taiwan is much stronger than Hong Kong. Taiwan has a pretty respectable military in its own right. You've got regional powers like Japan, even South Korea, that would also have a stake in what is going on there. So I don't think we're thinking about this any point before 2050. But after 2050, and if China cannot get Taiwan back into the fold through political and economic influence, which I think is by far their preference, I think that's why they're trying to isolate Taiwan diplomatically. They're trying to use every single economic tool they have in a box to try and make sure that it's better for Taiwan. It's almost inevitable for Taiwan to be closer to mainland China than just about anywhere else. But if you get to a point in 2050 where that's not the case, where China really is clashing with the United States on the things that matter most to China, let's say about getting oil from the Middle East or something like that, then yeah, I could definitely see a situation in which China is going to have to go for Taiwan. What I would say, though, and I stand by what I said in the piece, but if it gets to the point where China has to do anything violent or has to use its military in order to try and bring Taiwan back into the fold, in a way, it's already lost the game. That's not what they want. Hong Kong is the blueprint. Hong Kong is a way in which China can slowly use its massive cultural and economic and political influence to slowly transform something and basically consume it or assimilate it, right? If China is having to think about invading Taiwan and blocking it off from Western supporters, they've already violated every single rule Sun Tzu had, and probably that China won't be able to hold it. So it's kind of a catch-22. The moment they get powerful enough, they can try to go for Taiwan, but just by going for it, they ruin it, which I know that sounds convoluted, but it goes back to what's going on in Hong Kong and why I'm guessing that Beijing is so reluctant to deploy force there.
Very good. Jacob Shapiro is Director of Analysis for Geopolitical Futures, and I look forward to our next conversation, whenever that might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Leighton.